Okay, welcome everybody to today's webinar on the generator interconnection costs to the transmission system. It's my great pleasure to speak to you about recently completed briefings by our team at Berkeley Lab. I just wanted to share a few logistics up front. You will be muted during the entire webinar. But we, of course, still want to hear from you. Please send us any questions that you may have via the Q&A functionality of Zoom. You can see also questions from others there and upvote questions that you may be interested in. If you have something to share on a specific question, please feel free to comment on that as well. We will try to respond to some questions via the chat during the presentation, and we'll otherwise talk about them towards the end of the webinar. You'll be able to find today's slides and in a few days as well a video recording of this webinar on our homepage at the URL that is shown here, and we will post that into the chat. Looks like some people have trouble seeing the recording. Let me try to adjust that. 1 second. Okay, I hope this is better. Can you, maybe you can give me feedback via the chat whether this works a little better.
Yeah, Yo, I think that looks better.
Great. Okay. Thank you. So this work is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, and in particular, the Wind and the Solar Energy Technologies offices, the Strategic Analysis Team, and the new I2X program. We're very grateful for this public funding. But I want to state that the views and opinions that are expressed today do not necessarily reflect those of the US government. So Berkeley Lab's work on interconnection processes really rests on many shoulders, and it's my privilege today to present the work on interconnection costs. My name is Dr. Joachim or Yo Seal, and I'm a policy researcher at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I've become quite involved with our interconnection cost research over the last 2 years, so it's great to kind of share our findings with you today. With me today is Dr. Julie Kemp, who is a research scientist in our Electricity Markets and Policy Department and who has led the analyses of interconnection costs in New York ISO and in ISO New England. Our work has benefited from the input of several of our colleagues. Joe Rand leads our interconnection queue work, while Will Gorman and Fritz Kahl have become very involved in the bulk power aspects of DOE's I2X initiatives and the roadmap that we may talk about in a few minutes, while Dev Milstein leads our transmission valuation work. It is also a special privilege to welcome today Dr. Cynthia Bothwell, who's a contracted technology manager and grid integration engineer in the Wind Energy Technology Office at the Department of Energy. She supports there the systems integration portfolio that encompasses the bulk power system integration of land-based and offshore wind. The focus area of that team are transmission adequacy and access, grid reliability and resilience, wind hybrid systems, and wind cybersecurity. She has represented the wind program in the Interconnection Innovation Exchange initiative since its inception, and will briefly describe the I2X efforts that are connected to today's analysis. Before handing it off to Cindy for some introductory remarks, I wanted to provide some quick background on the current state of interconnection queues in the United States. Overall, requests to connect new generation and storage to the US transmission system have really surged in recent years. You're probably aware of that already if you've tuned in to today's call, but At the end of 2022, the total capacity of active interconnection requests was 6 times higher in 2022 than it was in 2014. Most of these new requests are entirely low carbon resources. So solar, wind, and storage now comprise 95% of the active capacity that is in the queue. But the timeline for these projects to proceed through the queue has increased substantially. The typical project now takes about 3 years after submitting a request to execute an interconnection agreement, up from around 20 months or so 10 years back. These long interconnection study durations delay project completions, of course, so that it now takes over 5 years for the typical project to reach commercial operations. And moreover, just a relatively small share of submitted original interconnection requests are ultimately built, just about 21% of requests and even just 14% of the associated capacity. In response to these growing interconnection backlogs and bottlenecks, FERC, or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, issued an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, or an ANOPR, in July of 2021. As FERC Commissioner Christie put it at the time, the interconnection processes are, to put it charitably, a mess. The ANOPR covered a range of topics across transmission planning and generator interconnection, but it had a notable focus on cost allocation for interconnection upgrade costs. That was then followed about a year later by a notice of proposed rulemaking, or a NOPR, which was primarily oriented around improving interconnection processing speed and efficiency. The interconnection NOPR basically ignored, however, the thorny issue of who actually pays for these interconnection costs. And meanwhile, several of the ISOs have taken the issue into their own hands and initiated major process reforms, most notably PJM, which is transitioning from a serial or first come, first serve process to a cluster-based approach, where the first ready, first served, so the first project that is actually able to move forward can then actually move forward. So they've switched to that. Similarly, MISO and NYISO are currently considering major overhauls to their interconnection process. And with this background, I'd now like to hand it over to Cindy to explain how the Department of Energy has responded to these growing interconnection issues through the launch of the Interconnection Innovation Exchange, aka I2X.
Thanks, Yo. Just checking, you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thanks for allowing me to be part of your presentation today. And this work is part of broader efforts that DOE is engaged in to make a difference in the interconnection space. And originally, as Yo mentioned, it's a collaboration between the Wind Energy Technology Office that I'm part of and the Solar Energy Technology Office. But we are broadening to include other resource types of interconnection, and including electric vehicles and charging issues associated with that. We have engaged 3 different national labs up front to be part of this, Lawrence Berkeley being one of them, and then the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. And we've been engaged in this for about a year. And, there's still a lot of work to go. And so first I'm going to talk about our mission, and that's to enable a simpler, faster, and fairer interconnection of clean energy resources. And that can't be done without also considering how that impacts reliability, resiliency, and security. So all of those are tangled together in the mission space. And we are engaged in both the distribution system and the bulk power system. Today, we're going to talk more about the interconnection work on the bulk power system, but we also do work on the distribution system similarly. So there's four main pillars to the I2X program. One is stakeholder engagement, and we have started a bunch of solution exchanges earlier this year, and they encompass 6 different topic areas, queue management and cost allocation being one, equity and energy justice, engineering practices and standards. Again, those are both on the distribution side and the transmission side, data transparency, workforce and training. And then it's not really a solution exchange, but we're doing EMT boot camps jointly with NERC. And those will be happening later this summer. And if you want more information about any of those solution exchanges, you can check out the website that's indicated there on the slide. So through those, we're engaging stakeholders in conversations because, you know, as the government or research entities, we approach problems different than the people with the boots on the ground trying to make the interconnections and the utilities and ISOs that have to process the interconnections. So we're trying to engage the whole, and I shouldn't leave out the regulators who have to, you know, kind of balance between those two entities and figure out and navigate the rules within their states. So all of those stakeholders are very important to the conversation, and we're trying to understand each of their perspectives, and that will build up to the roadmap that I'll talk about in a second. Another pillar is data and analytics, and the work you're going to see today is part of that prong, and that will both hopefully help all our stakeholders in all the different areas, but also help inform this the strategic roadmap and activities that we need to go forward. Next is our strategic roadmap. So we're hoping to have a draft out very soon on the strategic roadmap. It's not a DOE centric roadmap. It's going to encompass, you know, all areas of the interconnection process and all different entities that can help contribute to improving that process. It's also stakeholder informed, and that's one of the reasons we're holding these stakeholder engagements to first gather their input, and then the roadmap will be distributed through each of those solution exchange groups, target areas, to further refine the issues that they see and challenges and solutions that we can all work together to improve that process. Lastly, we have a pillar called technical assistance, and we have a couple efforts in that realm. First, pretty much since the onset, we've been holding office hours, and you can go to the website and sign up for that. They're like 25-minute consultation sessions if you have quick questions about interconnection issues, and that's been pretty widely utilized throughout the last year. Secondly, we earlier this year issued a request for technical assistance, and we had many applicants apply for that, and we're still in the process of evaluating and awarding that technical assistance to different entities to help improve interconnection processes. Next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit more on the solution exchanges. I kind of meant these are public. You can sign up on our website to each of these sessions. We have roughly 1 week, sometimes not because of holidays, and sometimes we have two on, and we're trying to spread the topic areas out so there's not a fatigue, but also keeping the processes moving forward. We usually have a panel that describes the different aspects of a technical issue, and then we allow the audience to ask questions of that panel and interject their comments to those solutions. And as I said, we're going to use all this information from those solution exchanges to help inform the roadmap and create better solutions. Go ahead, next slide, please. Okay, so again, the motivation for the cost analysis that you're going to hear about more today was that we found it very hard to get information. Developers said, we don't know how much things cost, so where we can interconnect, and a lot of other issues. And digging into the data, it is really difficult. Even though there might be publicly available data, it's not in an easily digestible form. And so one of the missions was to kind of bring this cost information together so people could access it and use that to help their decision-making processes. And so I guess without further ado, I'm going to pass it back to the team to really get into the meat of the issues and the great analysis that they've done. Thank you. Oh, and I'll be available at the end if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, Cindy, for highlighting DOE's great work here. And that interconnection costs really, represent a critical knowledge gap so far and an information barrier for many stakeholders. So let's now turn to our research project on generator interconnection costs. Berkeley Lab and a subcontractor of ours have spent quite some time over the past year and a half to manually scrape cost information from interconnection studies. And we collected a very robust sample, more than 2,500 project level interconnection cost estimates for SPP, MISO, PJM, New York ISO, and ISO New England. And that data set allows for some pretty nice analysis. Unfortunately, we were not able to get project level cost data from NYISO due to some data privacy issues. So we will not talk about that today, even though we're currently still trying to nail down some data for that ISO. ERCOT in Texas follows a different interconnection philosophy from the other ISOs with their so-called connect and manage approach. That results in very low interconnection costs for generators. Instead, costs are more widely spread among the ratepayer community there. And we've thus excluded that RTO from today's analysis. In the graphic on the right of this slide, you can see the typical interconnection study process for a generator, although of course the details vary by RTO. And in general, first project developer initiates an interconnection request and thus enters the so-called interconnection queue. Then a series of interconnection studies establish what new transmission equipment or upgrades may be needed, and assigns then the cost of that equipment to individual applicants. These studies get increasingly refined, starting out with a basic feasibility study, followed by a system impact study, and finally facility studies. And throughout this process, a generator has to prove increasingly stringent readiness criteria and provide more and more costly milestone payments. If developers sense that a project is not economically viable or may have encountered any other hurdles, they may withdraw from the study process at any time. And as alluded to earlier already, the majority of projects never reaches the final stage of signing an interconnection agreement and then commencing construction and ultimately reaching commercial operation. The interconnection costs estimates can vary substantially from one study phase and study result to the next, and thus developers have a certain incentive to remain in the queue for longer duration to see A, what the final costs really are, and then B, also if other applicants may withdraw from the queue, which in turn could decrease overall network upgrade needs and then associated costs. For our analysis today, we will use the latest and best available cost information for a given project at the time of our data collection. Our cost data are really only a subsample of all the projects that are currently in the interconnection queues. For example, studies with cost estimates are often not yet available for the most recent queue entrants. And then on the other hand, many RTOs remove cost details for older projects. Some projects withdraw before cost estimates are furnished, and then of course we cannot analyze those. And then finally, we only focus on new and unique generators and thus disregard upgrades to existing projects, which may come only with very low interconnection costs. As Cindy had already alluded to, collecting this cost data has been quite difficult, as the cost estimates are often only available in interconnection study PDFs that require time-intensive manual scraping. We've cleaned and standardized the data and made much of the underlying project-level cost data available on our website. To our knowledge, this is really the first time that this data can be easily accessed, and we've already received some very positive feedback from stakeholders about this new data source. So as you may start to use it, please let us know what you find, and if you have any feedback to that, we are eager to hear that. You're welcome to download the data at emp.lbl.gov/interconnection_costs. The interconnection studies that we analyzed reached back to the year 2000. And of course, a lot of time has passed since then. And to be able to compare costs across time, we've used a GDP deflator to convert all the costs to real 2022 dollars and present costs in dollars per kilowatt terms. So for solar projects, we use the AC capacity basically at the point of interconnection. And we've done that to just make costs a little bit more comparable. So to make this sampling approach a bit more tangible, here's an example of PJM. You can see in the left panel of the graph all the interconnection requests. And you can also see that many older applications have been superseded by newer ones, and with us disregard this superseded cost data. For another subset of projects, no interconnection studies with cost estimates have been posted yet to the PJM website, and you can see here again that this is especially true for recent entries. On the right side, you can see then our cost analysis sample. As you can see, our data is most robust for recently performed studies, which is what we will focus on today. The three colors represent different request statuses that we will continue to allude to throughout this presentation. In green are the projects that have completed all of the interconnection studies already, and a subset of them are already in service and generate electricity. The orange projects are in the active phase, as we say, and they are still working through the interconnection study process and will ultimately either complete that process and then kind of join this green cohort or withdraw. And, as already mentioned, in red are those projects that have withdrawn their interconnection request for one reason or another. In the interconnection queue, they really make up the greatest volume, as already 80% of applicants abandon really the study process. So before diving into the meat of our findings, one last qualifier that I wanted to add, namely that interconnection costs are not normally distributed, as you can see here, especially in these graphs on the top. You can see that there are many projects with rather low interconnection costs, but also some projects with very high interconnection costs. And although these high costs projects may be few in number, their high project costs can influence the sample mean quite a bit and pull it upward. And that is especially true if we would compare those cost estimates with median cost estimates. These median costs may have been more representative of a typical project experience of what interconnection costs are, but median statistics can be a little bit challenging to work with, especially if we try to add up various medians. And so for those reasons, we've decided to stick with the means, knowing about their limitations. And what we try to do is really, point to the underlying distribution of data often, especially with full appendices in the reports and the briefings. So you can dive into that if you like, and in general we call out as well if there would be any differences in the trends between medians and means. But for the most part, the storyline is really the same. So after this very long prelude, what have we actually found? Well, we find that on average, interconnection costs have really grown across nearly all of our analyzed regions. So not every RTO provided us with the same interconnection cost data for each request type. Again, those complete, active, and withdrawn projects. And each region also had differences in the available cost data over time. So the study periods that we present here differ slightly from one RTO to the next. We've kind of described that in this box on the top right, and thus grouped the time periods into a rather vague earlier and then a recent period. You can see in these three panels, complete, active, and withdrawn projects. And you can see how from the left side, the earlier period costs often rise for the more recent period. Right, you can see that interconnection costs have doubled in recent years for those complete projects and skyrocketed even more for projects that are still actively moving through the queue. And you can also see that active projects in general have higher interconnection costs than complete projects. And that is even more true for those that withdraw. So their costs have escalated the most in all regions really outside of MISO, where interconnection costs for withdrawn projects were very high already to start with. And those average costs for withdrawn projects are even higher now than for active projects. In general, we distinguish between two broad categories of interconnection costs. On the one hand, costs that are associated with attachment facilities at the point of interconnection, such as smaller substations or limited transmission line extensions. And then on the other hand, costs that are associated with broader network upgrades. These broader network costs are triggered by reliability or stability violations that have been identified in the studies to be caused by the new generator, and that may either require just modest upgrades of some breakers or very large investments, like the reconstruction of multiple high voltage transmission lines. And these network upgrade costs are often shared by multiple generators that each individually contribute to those upgrade needs. But in the ISOs that we studied, it is usually in the end, the project developer and not the broader ratepayer community that needs to pay for these network upgrades. And as you can see here, we find that it is these broader network upgrades that are really behind the recent cost increases. The graph shows the network cost percentage of total costs, and you can see that they make up a greater share in recent years. And in PJM, for example, more than 80% of the total costs of complete projects are just made up by these broader network upgrade costs. In MISO and PJM, network costs made up about half of the total costs among the active projects a few years back, but now really dominate the cost with 65 to 90%. And for withdrawn projects that face really these very high interconnection costs, network costs usually represent an even larger share, especially when compared to the complete projects. We are also able to look at how interconnection costs vary by fuel type and find that renewables and storage often face higher costs than natural gas generators. And the graph here shows only costs for recently studied projects and includes all request types. So it also includes here projects that ultimately withdraw their requests. You can see that the average solar interconnection costs are fairly consistent across regions, around $200 per kilowatt. Solar projects that complete all the studies have lower costs. So there the interconnection costs represent about 5 to 10% or so of total project capex. one can imagine, of course, how very large cost additions can easily ruin the economic viability of proposed projects. And we find that among the withdrawn solar projects, the interconnection costs can add between 20 to 40% of total project costs. And that may explain then why those applicants decide to withdraw their interconnection requests. Wind generators face greater cost variation, often around $150 per kilowatt in most ISOs, but $400 in MISO, and even more than $1,000 per kilowatt in ICE New England. And Julie may be able to talk a little bit more later about what's going on there. We also find that storage projects tend to have fairly high interconnection costs, even though, as storage projects, they have a lot of siting flexibility. But it may be especially congested regions that are very attractive from an energy arbitrage perspective that also come with high network upgrade costs. We have not unearthed all the reasons why renewables have higher interconnection costs, but I think a sound working hypothesis is just that these projects are often located in more rural areas where the existing transmission system is just weaker and has received fewer network upgrades over the past years. Thus, they require now network upgrades, and those are costly in order to accommodate these new generators. So they're just further away from the loads where traditionally, fossil generators have been placed. We're now transitioning to a few slides that look at interesting findings in each ISO, and I want to start with the largest market, PJM. And here you can see again very nicely how the local point of interconnection costs that are shown in the bold colors are very similar, but that it is really these broad network upgrade costs in the muted colors that really drive the cost differences, both between fuel types and then also again between the request statuses. So you can also see these large error bars around some of the withdrawn projects, indicating again that there's quite a variation in those network costs between projects, with some really facing very, very high costs. In PJM, we've also looked at cost variations by interconnection service type. In general, a generator can choose between capacity service, or what is often called the Network Resource Interconnection Service, or NRIS for short, or on the other hand, an energy service, or ERIS. NRIS enables a project to participate in capacity markets and reserves transmission capacity during high load hours. But it may come with additional network upgrade requirements, and those can be costly. ERIS projects, on the other hand, may face a little bit more local congestion during high load hours and are potentially curtailed before NRIS projects. I think it is interesting to see here that the vast majority of PJM projects really opts for the NRIS status despite higher interconnection costs. Another key takeaway here is that even among the ERIS projects, network costs are now the dominant cost driver for those projects that actively work their way through the queue or not withdraw their application. So just by choosing ERIS, you're not necessarily sidestepping all the network upgrade requirements. Turning to our second ISO, I just, we will examine here the geographic cost variation with a little more detail in the mid-continent and ISO or MISO. But I first wanted to provide some background on the recent enormous growth of the interconnection queue that MISO is currently dealing with. As you can see here in this graph, the 2022 cycle added more than 170 gigawatts of new capacity actively seeking interconnection. And that is more than double the additions from the previous year. Again, nearly all of this comes from zero carbon resources, most notably solar hybrids and storage. And MISO has responded to this in a number of ways. First, they already had established a first ready, first served cluster study process, and they're now building on that by introducing more stringent requirements for projects to enter and remain in the queue. But the ISO also plans significant investments into the overall transmission infrastructure to facilitate the integration of more renewables, especially in the northern part of the ISO. And these transmission investments are not, triggered by individual generators trying to interconnect, but are part of a longer-term regional transmission planning process. And these new transmission investments align with the areas that have had very limited available interconnection capacity, as you can see here on this on the right side. The interactive map is meant to inform prospective developers about the likelihood of network upgrades that may be triggered by their new projects. And if you compare that then to the maps on the left side that show our interconnection cost data, you can see that especially among completed and withdrawn projects, we do see a rough alignment between these higher interconnection costs in the north and then the limited transmission capacity that is available for new generators that was shown in the map on the right side. But the alignment is not perfect. Among active projects, for example, we see rather high costs in the Southwest and close to Texas, to ERCOT, near Houston. And the map shows some more yellow tones there as well. But overall, the South is supposed to have more transmission capacity available. Turning now to the Southwest Power Pool, SPP is a bit of an outlier among the ISOs, insofar as historically very few projects really faced any network upgrade costs at all. And even over the past few years, the local point of interconnection costs still make up most of the total interconnection cost, especially for projects that complete all studies. But as you can see, for those that are currently actively working through the interconnection queue, and then again, especially for those that ultimately withdraw, network upgrade costs have really become more dominant, right? So like if you look at the red bars between 2002, 2009, even those projects that withdrew didn't really face many network upgrade costs. In fact, they even had lower network upgrade costs than projects that completed the process and during the same timeline. But in recent years, POI costs may remain around $100 per kilowatt, but then the network upgrade costs add another $200 per kilowatt or so on top of that, really being the dominant cost driver now in SPP as well. In our interconnection cost work, we've sometimes found economies of scale, at least among some applicants. And so while projects in general with larger nameplate capacity have, of course, greater interconnection costs in absolute terms, we find that these costs do not always scale linearly. And instead, they may fall on a per kilowatt basis. So for example, for completed projects, for medium-sized projects, interconnection costs are around $60 per kilowatt or so, but then for very large projects, they're closer to $40 per kilowatt. And it's possible that project developers that lift these really large projects that have greater capital requirements may just in general have more sophisticated approaches to identify attractive points of interconnection to the transmission system. But in our example for SPP, it seems, however, that the relative decline in point of interconnection costs for these very large projects is really the primary driver of these economies of scale, as the network upgrade costs overall remain rather stable. In general, these data are rather noisy, and we don't necessarily find economies of scale for active or withdrawn projects, or for some fuel types, for example, the natural gas projects. And with that, I want to conclude my part of the presentation, I'll now hand it over to Julie, who will discuss some more findings for ISO New England and New York ISO. I just wanted to remind you again that if you have any questions about the data or findings that we presented so far, please do submit these questions via the Q&A function of Zoom, and we'll try to answer them either on the fly or later at the end of the presentation. So Julie, please take it away.
Thanks, Yo. And regarding the Q&A, in addition, if you don't have a question of your own, but you see a question that is interesting to you, you can upvote that by clicking the thumbs up, and that'll help us prioritize, because we might not be able to get to every question in the list today. So in New York, in addition to examining the most recent study for a given project, we also examined how interconnection cost estimates change as projects move through the process. So first, a project completes an initial feasibility study, then a system impact study, which is a bit more refined, and then finally a detailed facility study. And what this figure shows is that we find costs tend to increase at each study step. But especially there's the biggest increase in that final facility study. Between the system impact and facility study, costs change by at least 50% for more than half of projects. And for a quarter of all projects, the costs at least double at this stage. These large cost deviations pretty late in the study process could be one explanation why applicants stay in the queue for a long time before ultimately deciding whether or not they want to withdraw or ultimately complete their interconnection. Additionally, this means that if these past trends continue, costs for projects that are currently active and therefore are usually earlier in the study process will likely increase somewhat as they progress. Next slide. The geographic distribution of interconnection costs does offer some insights, but at the same time, it also highlights this challenge of estimating costs far in advance without specific detailed locational models. So this first row of maps shows the average interconnection costs by county and by the queue status. So for all projects, and then complete and active and withdrawn. Notice, based on these arrows, that the two highest cost counties are on opposite sides of the state, but each of them contain pretty sizable load centers. Shifting to the second row, where we're looking at the costs by resource type, notice that in the Southeast on Long Island, this is a place where capacity prices are high due to transmission constraints. There's Suffolk County, where there are high costs for solar, but low costs for storage. Meanwhile, just one county over, there are high costs for storage. So these kind of differences within a pretty small geographic area really emphasizes the role that point of interconnection level and circuit level characteristics play in determining interconnection costs. Next slide. A few minutes ago, Yo showed this comparison of costs by resource type across the different regions we studied. And you may have noticed that, ISO New England stood out as having the highest costs for both onshore wind and solar interconnection costs. Examining this trend more closely here, we can compare the striped bars in this figure, which cover 2010 to 2017, so that's sort of like earlier time period, with the solid bars representing studies conducted since 2018. And you can see that, interconnection costs for solar and wind have more than doubled in recent years. Note that for onshore wind, 80% of these recent projects have now withdrawn. And we can kind of infer that those withdrawals are likely, at least in part, because of these quite high costs to interconnect. Could you advance? For solar in this figure, we can see that there are projects with both high and low costs kind of scattered throughout the region. But for wind, onshore wind, all of the recent projects are located in Maine, and many of them are in quite remote areas where the existing transmission system is pretty limited, And so these high costs that we see are the result of, the significant build out that would be required to connect substantial new generation in these areas that currently do not have much load or much generation. Next slide. Yo talked a minute ago about how costs scale based on the project size in SPP. And I'm going to kind of share some similar findings for ISO New England. What you can see in this figure is the average per kilowatt interconnection cost, both by the resource type, which is each cluster, and by the nameplate capacity. So the bars are sorted where the smallest size projects are in light blue on the left, and then the largest projects are in dark blue on the right. We see for solar this kind of stepping down of costs, which points to economies of scale in interconnection costs. But we don't kind of see that type of pattern for other resource types. Just to clarify, larger projects still have greater costs on absolute terms. This is on a per capacity basis. So with that completes our kind of tour of these select findings in each region. You can find the full set of results for each of these areas on our website, which has been put in the Q&A answer section several times. But I want to emphasize that, Berkeley Lab and the Department of Energy's work on interconnection is ongoing. Some things we're working on now is diving into a deeper comparative analysis among these regions that we've kind of spoken about independently here. And, we'll focus on, again, how costs have evolved, but specifically how they differ between regions. And we're going to continue to engage with stakeholders through the solutions exchange meetings that Cindy discussed earlier, and we're crafting a roadmap to identify these opportunities that can improve the interconnection process. We're also interested in studying these costs in additional regions beyond what we covered today, but that is pending data availability. So to conclude on the next slide, we've shown that interconnection queues have grown in size over the past years, and this has resulted in lengthy study processes and high withdrawal rates. Interconnection costs are difficult to obtain. They're not available as pre-request information, and they're, even for completed studies, they are challenging to collect, took a lot of time and labor to collect. But once we did do that work, we found that interconnection costs have grown over time in all of these studied regions. More often than not, upgrade requirements in the broader network are the main driver of costs, though costs at the POI have tended to increase as well. Many projects, that face the highest costs withdraw from the queue, and comparing across different resource types, we find that renewables and storage have higher connection costs than natural gas powered plants. I'd like to thank all of you for your time today, for joining us, and encourage you to contribute your perspective. All of us have different unique perspectives on interconnection, and you can contribute those perspectives through the I2X program. There's a number of opportunities listed here throughout the summer where you can engage with us and share your perspectives. On the next slide, I listed our contact information. We'd really welcome you to get in touch with either follow-up questions or feedback, suggestions. And it also provides the link to the full studies as well as the data. With that, I know we have a number of questions in the Q&A, so I think we can transition to discussing some of those questions that the audience has submitted. Yo, do you have a first question that you'd like to address?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. So thank you very much already for all the answers or questions that you've submitted. We have at the moment about 25 or so outstanding ones. I don't think that we'll be able to get to all of them during the remaining 8 minutes here, but for those of you for whom we can't get to them, we'll try to follow up via email if that is associated with a question. But to start out with, there's some questions about, in general, like the confidentiality of certain aspects of data in the interconnection studies. For example, the geolocations of certain intermittent resources, which some ISOs treat as confidential and others do not. The question asks whether or not there is push for greater information transparency. And I think, like, yes, in general, that is one of the core goals of the I2X initiative. You know, currently we're preparing this roadmap that deals a lot with increased data transparency, information transparency, availability of pre-application information for ISOs, etc. So I'd say in general, yes, there is a move to more transparency going on, both like within, you know, this I2X initiative, but also within some of the ISOs and at FERC. One other question that, you know, just randomly picking out here, where somebody was asking whether or not, or asking why we're not including any data for nuclear generators. And the fact is just that so far there are very few nuclear generators in any of the interconnection queues, and thus there are very few interconnection cost studies for such nuclear generators. And because of that, the data sample was, you know, very small. We have a few legacy generators, nuclear generators, that have received like minor capacity upgrades, but in general, there seems to be relatively little commercial interest to really, you know, develop these compared to all the other wind, solar, and battery projects that are in the queue. There was one question about, so we've been dealing a lot now with the interconnection, you know, processes, where we found that these broader network upgrades are really what drive costs. Yet the I2X initiative is more focused on the interconnection process. And so there was a question whether in general DOE is also interested in pushing for more overall transmission upgrades, and has initiatives there. And indeed, you know, the FERC has identified these longer-term, larger interregional transmission plans to be like a focus of the recent NOPR, and the Grid Deployment Office at DOE is, you know, working a lot on that. Cindy, I don't know whether you want to speak any more about that, maybe. If you're still here. Currently, I can't hear you. Okay, maybe moving on in the interest of time. Julie, there was one question about offshore wind and why offshore wind had apparently rather low interconnection costs, especially compared to onshore wind.
Yeah, I can speak to that question. So first, I'd like to point out that spur lines that can, you know, are on the before the point of interconnection between the project location and that point of interconnection are generator costs, not interconnection costs, and aren't included for any of the projects analyzed here. However, for offshore wind specifically, that type of transmission is a big part of what you might think about as the, you know, costs to interconnect. However, it's on the generator side, not as part of the system interconnection costs. So that's at least just one reason why the cost might be lower than you would have expected.
Thanks, Julie. Is there another one that you want to take on?
I'm taking a look through them now.
Okay, there was, while you look at that, maybe one other question pertaining to affected system costs that I didn't, you know, speak to specifically about today. But so we've, you know, this is a summary webinar. We've published 5 ISO specific briefings. You know, each of them are like 15 to 20 pages or so, I think. where we dive much deeper into each individual ISO. So if you have specific interest for an individual ISO, I encourage you to look at those. And in the one for MISO, we have looked at affected system costs as well. So these are network upgrades that are not just triggered within the ISO where the generator wants to interconnect, but also in other neighboring ISOs, and especially between MISO and SPP. You know, there are these affected system costs. So we have like a whole text box on that in there, and you could look at that if you're interested in that.
There's a question for ISO New England asking how much of the costs are due to supply chain shortages or supply chain challenges. I would emphasize that these like costs that we're reporting are over a pretty long time horizon, from 2010 to 2017 for kind of the older time period, and then 2018 to 2021 for more recent projects. So to the extent that, you know, the specific costs, the supply chain costs of different upgrades or labor to complete these upgrades, you know, that would be included here. These are all of the costs that are estimated to complete those projects. But again, I would just emphasize that even for this recent time period, the studies are from 2018 through 2021. So, you know, kind of short-term supply chain fluctuations, I would expect to be fairly smoothed out by that kind of time period.
Okay, thanks, Julie. And then finally, there were a couple of questions about just in general, like whether or not we plan to continue to collect costs, and whether or not costs may be collected for other non-ISO regions as well. In general, we found it difficult so far to, like in a first look, to get cost data for the non-ISO balancing authorities, but we are again currently evaluating whether or not there's a there for us to collect. Regarding whether or not we'll be able to continuously update this going forward, that depends. There have been some discussions about that, but you know, we've not fully nailed it down in detail. There's an increasing move, at least among some ISOs, to make some of this interconnection cost data more transparent. For example, SPP is now publishing interconnection cost data, at least for the system impact study results, in an Excel table that can be downloaded. And so, you know, there where it doesn't require as much manual scraping, I think that would be very, you know, much easier to kind of continue to update on an ongoing basis. PJM has similar goals. One drawback there in general is that these are often just intermediate cost estimates and are not the cost estimates of the final generator interconnection agreement, which is what we ideally would like to look at. But you know, that is one option. And then in general, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about AI in recent years. We've not yet leveraged ChatGPT to like process these interconnection study PDFs for us, but are curious whether or not that might be an option for us, which would enable us to, you know, kind of scale this process and just make it a little less time intensive going forward. So you know, in general, we see the value of this data, and of course would like to keep this data set current to continue to inform the reform processes, and maybe see whether some of the proposed reforms that are out there may, you know, be successful in decreasing some of the interconnection costs. As Juliet mentioned too already, we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive now, comparing costs between ISOs in an upcoming study with a little bit more rigor, and so that at least is the very next step that we've planned here. And with that, we're now at the top of the hour, and I thank you very much for your attention and time today. If you have any further questions or thoughts, please do reach out to us. Our emails are here. Again, I want to encourage you to participate in the I2X initiative. I think this is a great opportunity for many of you to make your voices heard and become part of that process, and hopefully, shaping solutions that will facilitate an easier, faster, and more efficient interconnection process for all these resources that are waiting to come online. So thank you very much, and have a great day.